And I would like this to, first of all, just welcome, Tsitsi. It's been such a pleasure meeting you and having you here all this week, and we're grateful for your presence. We're grateful for your writing. We're grateful for your image making. For those who may be unaware, of course, you can read much more and see much more later this week. You'll be showing some film, I think, tomorrow. Yes? So, excellent. While you're best known for the Nervous Conditions trilogy, Nervous Conditions, you are also the author of a brand new nonfiction work. Right? This is hot off the presses. It's in London right now. It'll be, I think, out in the US in January. Yes, Black and Female. I encourage you all to pre-order it. It's an excellent book. My students read it just this week for this. We had a wonderful conversation just before this. And it's a beautiful, beautiful foray into nonfiction writing, into thinking about your political activism, the history of Zimbabwe. And it's full of astonishing prose, and I'm going to treat you all several times during this conversation to some brief excerpts. I may have you read, in fact. But this one I would just like to, this is from the end of the introduction. You write, "I have been in flight from the malign realm of the imaginary that constructed first colonial Rhodesia, then the Republic of Rhodesia, and their successor, militarized elitist Zimbabwe, for as long as I have existed, wherever my body has been situated. I do not know the destination of my symbolic migration, and doubt that there is one, given the current construction of global society. The following essays are a location in the invisible geography of my asylum." And we just want to thank you for making this place, right? I hope a place of asylum, a place of happiness, a place of retreat, right, from all the work and the engagement that you're constantly involved in. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Ernest. That's such a wonderful welcome, such a lovely introduction. It definitely makes this place a place of asylum. Thank you. And the whole Windham-Campbell Prizes has definitely been a great location of asylum for me.
We're happy to have you here. And so I thought that we might just begin, right, thinking about image, right? So for many people, you're known as a writer, right? But you're also an incredibly prolific filmmaker. For those who don't know, there were challenges in finding a publisher for Nervous Conditions initially, and so you went to Germany to pursue film school around 1989. Yes. So I wondered if you could just talk to us a little bit about that movement, right, across sort of film and writing, how you think about that, how you think about your own practice as an image maker, and maybe we'll use that as a way to get to the photographs that Wright made.
Okay. Well, yes, so I had the same experience with film as I had with writing, in that I did not see myself in the films or the moving images content that was available when I was a young person in the 1960s and 1970s. And my first experience with moving images content was television in England, where I lived for a while as a very young child. And I was just mesmerized by the scope, the range of images. You know, at the time, Doctor Who was all the rage, and so you could see the Daleks being their evil selves, or you could see Mary Poppins being incredible, or you could see this Millie, I think her name was, singing My Boy Lollipop, and all this kind of thing. And so I was just mesmerized by the sheer variety of worlds that these images could present. And that was really very important for me. Then we moved back to Zimbabwe, which was Rhodesia at the time. It was the mid-1960s, and there was no television. So that fell out of my life, and that is when I turned to books. Now, the interesting thing is that I was fostered in a lower working class family, so there were not many books in that family, and I had television. When I moved back, my parents were educators, and they both had master's degrees, so we had books in the family. And I kind of had this idea that what I had in the family was the correct thing, and that had just been a moment. And so I turned to books. That's when I turned to books. And then, to my surprise, a film arrived in Rhodesia, and it was not in the cinema, which was segregated, but it was in the drive-in, which black people were allowed to drive into and remain in their cars in. So my father took us to see that, and it was To Sir with Love. Yes. And this was really amazing for me because I had not thought that my father would be interested in that content, which is so romantic in so many ways. And so that was when I began to think, oh, maybe there's something to film as well. But I did not see many films of that nature where there was anything that I could identify with. And so I returned to writing. That was something that was available to me. And so it was only after Nervous Conditions was written and had not been published, and I was at a loose end. I had tried so many things in life and nothing had worked. I had thought I'll be a writer. And when Nervous Condition failed to find a publisher, I thought, well, I failed at that too. And at that time, somebody asked me to write the story for a film. And that became Neria, which became the highest grossing film in Zimbabwe at the time. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe it isn't writing per se, but I should really go towards film. Then I did a stint in a video cooperative that was doing kind of community documentaries. And this was about the land reform. People know about the land reform of 2000, which was a particular phase of the land reform. But there had been land reform from 1980, independence in Zimbabwe, on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. And there were not many willing sellers. That was the whole problem. But there were some. And so I think it was an American organization wanted to assess what was happening, whether this was working well. And so I went around the whole country as the researcher for that. And it was just so amazing to talk to people I would never meet in real life, and so many different kinds of people. And I discovered interesting things. I discovered, for example, that communal small-holding projects were working. There were other projects where single families had like small to medium-sized plots, which were not working so well because often the man was not present, and so the woman was there and had to try to organize all this work on her own, and that didn't work so well. And then there was the case where some farmers had, in fact, sold their commercial farms to the government. And what had happened is that the government had tried to make these into cooperatives. And so combatants from the war were just sent back to work on these farms. Most of them had never seen a tractor in their lives before, let alone have the capacity to drive one. And so I remember being so shocked. I arrived at this farm that had been a huge commercial farm, and the new occupants had built their pole and dugger homes, and they had their little fields, and that's all they were cultivating. And so I asked them why, and they said, this is all we're able to do. That's the only school they had. So I realized, excuse me, that this kind of documentary filmmaking really was useful in telling real stories that people didn't know about. So I decided to go to film school. When I decided to go to film school, I had to make the decision as to how, because I had no money, and I knew that film school was expensive. Some people I knew had been in LA, and I thought, well, LA is not going to work for me because it's just much too expensive. So let me try others that might not be expensive. For the same reason, the UK wasn't going to work, you know, because fees for foreign students were astronomical. So I thought maybe Cuba, since Zimbabwe is meant to be socialist and they're a socialist country, they might be sympathetic. So I went down to the Cuban embassy to ask them how I could get to the Havana Film School. And so there was this big white Cuban guy, and he said to me, "What did you say?" And I said to him, I would like you to help me to get to the Havana Film School. And he went out of the room. And he came back with 3 other big white Cuban men. And he said, "This is the girl who says she wants to go to film school." And they started laughing. So I thought, okay, it's not going to be Cuba. So what happened is I was friendly with with a girl who worked at the German volunteer service, as it was called. And she must have mentioned this, because she then came back with the message that there was a particular school, the German Film and Television Academy, which at that time was really quite progressive, and that was a school I should apply to. And so I applied to it. And it was a 2-tier application. You had to send in your written application. The problem was I had no German. But the friends at the place where my friend worked translated my work. And I thought, well, okay, that's that. Then a month or so later, I was told that I had been invited to the entrance exam. So now I had to find the money for the ticket to the entrance exam, and I had to go and speak German. So I did find the money for the ticket. I don't even remember how. But I also had a 2-week crash course, like 3 or 4 hours a day. And then I got on the plane and I went. And the German system is such that if you are not a German language mother tongue speaker, you can take a dictionary in with you and you can have longer. So everybody would finish their task, and I would be sitting there, you know, what's chicken? And then we're looking at, okay, is it neuter, is it feminine, what is it? And the invigilator, are you not finished yet? So no, I'm not finished yet. And so it took about 2 hours for me to do one of the tasks, but that didn't matter. And in the end, they invited me back. So that's how I got there. And now I could go on and on about the images, but I'm sure you have something else to
Well, I have
ask
other
me.
questions, but I mean, one of the things that I would love to, thank you for that. I mean, this is, it's wonderful. I mean, the twists and turns are fascinating. And I find that it actually reminds me in very interesting ways of Wright's own path, right, to Ghana and to sort of the making of these images, right? So if we think about Richard Wright, you know, someone who's born in Mississippi, right, you know, questions of land, questions of property, questions of farming are completely central, right, for him growing up. He's moving back and forth, you know, across with different family members, right, who are involved in the kind of the post-plantation economy. And so that's a crucial part of kind of his formation in terms of how he thinks about image and image making. Most here will know him from Native Son, right? His sort of most famous novel, right? But soon after making Native Son, right, he then goes on to make 12 Million Black Voices, right, which is a photo book captioned by him, featuring a number of photographs, right, in the documentary style, right, mostly depicting rural black life in the American South, right? And so he goes around, right, sort of revisiting sites, right, and also by himself and also through these photographs, right, and kind of thinking through the documentary and what that particular gaze can do. And then he himself ends up also expatriating, right, and moving to Paris, not to Berlin, but spends, you know, essentially the rest of his life there with his family, except for a short stint, I believe in Brazil, someone correct me, right, where he attempts to make a film successfully, with questionable success, of Native Son, right? And so he himself, you know, without maybe going to film school, right, has this kind of experiment in, you know, in directing one of his own books, right, and sort of moving that across the line from word to image. So there are actually some fascinating parallels here. And then for those who don't know, right, he's kind of, he's invited essentially by Kwame Nkrumah in the early 50s, right, to Ghana, right, to see the sort of the political transformation in progress, right? And so the photos that we're looking at here are made while he's living in Ghana in the early 50s. Black Power, the book that results from that, is published in 1954. So there are some actually fascinating parallels in terms of how the two of you have moved back and forth between text and image. And so, you know, I'm thinking about politics and I'm thinking about form, but you said image, so let's go there. I mean, there's this lovely moment in Black and Female where you talk actually about this, right? You say that while you were doing your O-levels, ideas of rhythm and meter from our O-level poetry textbook, Adventures in Modern Verse, completed your education until you went to film school 2 decades later, right? And so that idea that rhythm and meter have this kind of relationship, right, that bridges text and image, I find super fascinating. And so I'd love to just invite you to talk about image making and how you brought a kind of poetic eye to the work of film.
Mm-hmm. It was extremely difficult to learn how to make films in Germany, and that wasn't just because I didn't speak German well. It is very difficult to explain what the gaze does, what a particular kind of gaze does. And it is the gaze on the film, but it's also the gaze that informs the curriculum. So, for example, I found myself, I think it was in my first year, confronted with Birth of a Nation. And it was being presented to us in Germany in like the last decade of the last millennium as a masterpiece. And I was so absolutely shocked. And nobody spoke about the content. It was all about form. I know, it was amazing. It was devastating for me. And then shortly after that, I had to watch Nanook of the North. And I thought to myself, I have come to the wrong place. But what that did for me, which was really important, because it was a practical course where you learned the craft. And we had very little theory. And I can remember that the way the courses were structured is that you had visiting lecturers or teachers coming in, and we had some coming in from Eastern Europe because that was the time that Eastern Europe was opening up as well. And the lecturers from Eastern Europe would try to say, please go and read. You know, you have to read widely to expand your mind. And the attitude was, no, we just want to make beautiful pictures. And so I picked that up and I thought, I have to start reading to understand why I am seeing the kinds of films that I am seeing. Another formative moment in my education was when one of our tasks was to make a documentary. In fact, there are 2 aspects to this formative moment, so 2 formative moments or 1 long formative moment. One of the men in my group made a documentary about a basketball team. This was a basketball team in the 1990s in Germany. There were not many players of color. In fact, there was 1 in this team. So I hadn't seen a black person on the screen since Birth of a Nation in all the films that we were watching in the course. And so I was really excited and really happy. And, you know, basketball players tend to have a certain physique, which is appealing to look at. So I thought, okay, good, I'm going to get an eyeful of this. But then what I noticed is that this is how I perceive it, this is how the text spoke to me, is that every time this person of color, a black person, came into the picture, the director would cut.
Oh.
And of course, he wasn't the subject, but I still found that it was too systematic to not have a cause. I don't know how conscious it was, but that is what I saw. And I thought, no, I've got to go and find out what's happening. This was the 1990s. Really, the only issues of diversity that were beginning to reach the mainstream at the time were gender. And so, of course, I read your classic gender texts on that with Laura Mulvey and Difference. And then I realized that you can use that category of difference to analyze any aspect of difference in film. And that's when it struck me that it's all about the power relations. And so the feminist film scholars were talking about the power relations around gender constructing film in a certain way. And I realized that you can talk about the power relations around race constructing film in a certain way. And that was a liberating moment for me, because I felt that it is not that there is something wrong with me, but the context that I am in does not understand that it needs to expand. And so that gave me a kind of a mission. And fortunately, some other black women were admitted to the school. And so we could work together, and I was able to get my work done. But it was very important for me to start thinking about the theory of representation in cinema. And that has informed how I have conducted my work since then. And I was really fortunate, because that's where I met my husband, Olaf, who is sitting there, who I met in Switzerland and thought he was Swiss, because I was trying to escape what was going on in Berlin at the time. But then Olaf came to Germany, and so eventually he was able to help me to work on some of my projects. So the other formative moment was when we were to do a reportage, and this was the early 90s. And there was, that's the time when there was the resurgence of Nazism, so that outbreak of neo-Nazism in Germany. And some of the black men that I knew were victims of that. And of course, there was the time when the asylum houses were burnt down. And so we had one of the big magazines, you know, that's the time when the print magazines were also going into TV. So they came to give us a seminar on reportage. And so I told him I wanted to do a reportage on what we called an Afro shop. You know, that's where you could get African skincare and hair care, beauty products and so forth. And there was one in Berlin that I knew of at the time. And so this was newsworthy to me, you know, but of course it wasn't newsworthy to him. His idea was that you've got black people being beaten up and burnt to death, and all you want to do is talk about hairstyles. You know, and so I tried to explain to him how that kind of embodiment is what is leading to those people being burned. And I don't think he really understood the connection. So I was told that if I wanted to continue with that project, I would have to leave the seminar. He couldn't actually stop me doing it, because by rights I had my production funds allocated by the school, but he just refused to have anything to do with me. So Olav and I made the film with the help of our friends, and it's really amazing. I have an African-German community in Zimbabwe, and just about 2 years ago I decided to screen this film so that they could see it. And one of the members of the community is a German woman married to a Zimbabwean man, and so she has daughters in their 20s. They had left home. They'd gone to Germany by then. But she saw this film and she was so amazed. She said, see, we've got to talk more about this. More people have got to see the film. You know, so it was speaking to things that people who have experienced interracial situations understand to be important, but which I guess somebody who's a commissioning editor at that kind of television would simply not have within his frame of reference at all. So that's when I realized that if I had thought it was difficult being published, it was going to be even more difficult getting to make the films I wanted to make.
Yes, yes. And I love that you bring up just the question of embodiment, right? And how embodied knowledge changes our perspective, alters the gaze, informs what we see, what we don't see, what we value, what we don't value. You write so much and so beautifully, and we've spoken a bit this week about the role of the body in writing, and the role of the body in image making, right? And you said, I think yesterday, right, that you see the writing that you do and really all the creative work that you do as a kind of, something that emanates out of, right, embodied experience. And I wondered if we could talk about that and think in particular about stillness. We've been talking a lot about the moving image, and here, of course, we have sort of still images. And you've spoken quite a bit, or written quite a bit, in Black and Female about your devotion to stillness, the work that stillness does, in working through and thinking through difficult political experiences and personal experiences, as if those could be separated. So I wonder if we could maybe turn to think about these still images, right? What's the work of stillness? How do we think about what work these photographs are doing? And I guess you've said a bit about reportage and documentary. And I think another term that we used as we were talking about these photos is the ethnographic, right? And so if I could just invite you to think about those genre differences and also stillness and what these moments of sort of still image are.
It's very interesting that you bring up stillness, because I do not have a practice in still photography. But when I am shooting and everything is correct, there is always that moment of stillness before the scene begins, to just check whether everything is emitting the kind of emotion that I want to emit. Because if it doesn't do that at that moment, then the whole scene is going to be off. And this is something that I've tried to teach young filmmakers in Zimbabwe, that you have to take that moment and you have to be able to connect with your emotions to what you have constructed. Because you have this thing, this drive to construct something, you construct it. But unless you can refer back to that original impulse, you cannot be sure whether you have constructed the right thing. And the tendency amongst many young filmmakers is to say, well, I've got it, and so it must be working. And then the action starts, and then you realize when you look at it, oh, something was wrong. And actually, that's not something I learned by myself. Bella Tar was one of my lecturers. They don't really lecture at Dozenton. And he was the one who taught me that you have to take that moment of stillness, and if it's not working, don't be afraid. That was at the time that we were transitioning from celluloid to tape at that time. Yeah. And he was saying it is much more important to get that initial moment right, because you will save so much later on. And so I appreciate the composition of stillness and what that can evoke and what it can narrate. With respect to the images, some of which are at the back there, and I've seen others on the internet, I have a kind of ambivalent feeling, because when I look at those photographs and I think, okay, this is the 1950s, I am sure, just by looking and seeing the reaction of the subjects, that this person was most likely, the photographer was most likely not what I call in my book lesser pigmented. Yes. Because such a person would have evoked simply a different aura, a different relationship. Sometimes I see mild curiosity in the subject's eyes as they stand there posing, and I doubt very much, at least thinking about my part of the world, which is Southern Africa, that that kind of mild curiosity, which has no sense of aggression, no sense of belligerence, would have been the case. And actually, if you look at some of those old photos of Rhodesia as it was then from the turn of the last century, you will see what I mean in the way the subjects present themselves. So that I thought was really interesting and very positive. But on top of that, I still did see what I would call an ethnographic gaze. And it's because this is how we are taught. You know, photography is taught in a certain way. It's like the way we are speaking English now. And the patterns of a language evoke patterns in your mind. You know, Saussure, language evokes a mythology. So the camera also evokes a mythology. And we are told you have to position it here, and the light has to be like that. And that is in order to evoke a certain mythology, create a certain mythology. And so that's really important because there are two pictures that are essentially of the same subject at the back there. And in my opinion, one of them has a less ethnographic gaze than the other. We spoke about it.
You also and there off to the left.
Yes. It's a woman doing some household chore with a man behind her to the left and a child to the right. And in the wider framed picture, the focus is behind the woman. So it is not saying, here is an object, it is female, it is doing this. It is part of a composition, and it gives layers to the picture. And then in the second one, the frame is tighter, and the focus is now on the woman. So you get very much that idea. Here is Ms. Nanook doing doing her thing, which I cannot really. I think it would be normal for somebody, in fact, for anybody who has trained themselves in film and not really had the time, or in still photography, has not really had the time and the community in which to discuss those kinds of issues. And we're talking about the 1950s. These issues were not even being discussed in terms of gender at that time. So I think it was a very brave foray into documenting what he saw, and I think that is really wonderful. There's a photograph that really stands out for me there, and it seems to be like some kind of political gathering. And for me, that is where the photographer becomes one with the subject, and the distance collapses. And you simply see men who are having an intense debate about something amidst other men. And so, of course, the subject matter would have been foreign. So how does one begin to photograph that which is foreign? You will have that questioning gaze to begin with. It just then becomes a question of how you continue to articulate that gaze. And I think that there must have been something about him that people found reassuring and trustworthy when I look at the way they look back at the camera. So I like that very much. Yeah.
I love that. And I love that how you're teaching us, right, to not just look at what's in the frame, right, but to see the photographer behind the frame, even when he's not there, right? How do you look through the frame backwards, paths, right?
Yeah.
I love that. And he writes. I mean, he writes actually in the book, right, about sort of being seen with the camera, right, and what it feels like to have other people watch him.
Exactly. And I think that the way other people would have watched him, those particular people would have watched him in particular, would be different to how they would have watched somebody with a BBC camera, for example. And so I think he does give us a different insight into those people than what you would normally find from European stills of the same time.
Yeah. I want to double back actually to what you just said about having a community, right, of people who can talk with you, think with you, and help you to think past, right, the sort of mythologies and the structures that the grammar of image making imposes upon us, right? You need actually other people to help you see around that. I would love for you to just talk to us actually about the community that you found in film school, right, and how you all began the work of collaboratively talking through and thinking through, because I think you're right, that Wright doesn't have that. And I'm interested for those, you know, who might be image makers here, right, students, faculty. How do we work together in community to think differently about how to make images?
For me, in the 1990s, it was very important for me to have people who understood what I said when I say I want to make a film about products that are said to be beauty products that are aimed at the black market. It was important for me to have someone who understood that some of these products are actually very harmful, and to understand the importance of that narrative, to understand the importance, the actual political significance of skin lightening creams. And I did have that community, and that is why I was able to make the film. If I had not had anybody who could come and participate in the documentary, who understood those things, I would not have had a documentary. Or I might have had a well-intentioned documentary that nevertheless would have put the wrong message across, you know, because the film is so good at getting at a truth. So unless it is your truth that you are speaking, something different is going to come along. So just the actual practice requires community and the talking through of what you want to do. But then there are the other communities as well. That TV station actually took 2 or 3 of the best films to broadcast them, which means that a film like mine would never stand any chance of being broadcast, which means you're never going to earn any money. So you need other communities besides your artistic communities. You need your economic communities. And this is something that is still a big problem to this day on both sides of the Atlantic. Less so here now because people have entered, they've entered the sector and they've been successful and they know the importance of it, which is why Viola Davis spoke about exhuming the stories in 2017 in her Oscar acceptance speech, exhuming the stories of those whose stories were not allowed to be told in this medium. So we can see that our community is extensive. It can include those who are past. I think that's really important because we have so many stories that should have been told. We need more people to be looking at the same thing from different angles, because in decades past you would hear, oh, okay, we've already had the story about slavery. Exactly. So community helps to find different angles to the same theme. Nobody talks about how many films we've had about a certain royal family, for example. So this is why community is really important. It's important at every level of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of community, maybe this is a good moment to open up to the wider community seated here. I would love to invite anyone if you have questions, comments, things that you'd like to ask CNC. Please.
Just a quick question on what kind of access do we have to your films?
Most of the films are online. I have made short films, several, can't remember now, and I run an organization for young women where I teach them basic film skills along with Olav. He does the technical side of the teaching, and I do the narrative side of the teaching, directing and script writing. And we have to make the kind of film that we get the money to make, and these young people have to do the same. So the kind of film that we get to make is usually within the development framework. So it's about HIV, it's about women's rights, it's about violence against women, this kind of thing, which I did for a long time. In fact, Neria, that I wrote the story to, is also about women's inheritance rights in Zimbabwe. And I think there's a place for that. But I think when you instrumentalize film for an agenda, first of all, it curtails people's imagination. They are no longer able to imagine these immense worlds that can exist in our imagination. Imagination is shrunk to the problem, oh my goodness, HIV, and actually the problem becomes the protagonist. What changes in the film is the problem. And so if you are the target audience of that film, you begin to identify with the problem. And I am not entirely sure whether this is by accident, because I think to myself, if I have been able to work this out, then other people have been able to work this out. So why do they continue to do it? Okay, so right now they're doing a series of 5-minute videos that we call Picture My Life. And it began with videos, 5-minuters on the Me Too, so Zimbabwean survivors of that kind of sexual abuse. And then it went into Picture My Life, which was just general violence against women. And now they're doing Picture My Vote, because we have an election coming up and our government is being its usual repressive self. And I've just as I was coming over here, I was listening to a Twitter space in which we were told that they have begun training militias again that will be unleashed on the people. It is said January next year. So this Picture My Vote is to try and get people to really think about the importance of voting, so that hopefully, even if there is that kind of intimidation with militias, some people will still be able to brave it and escape it in some way, make sure that they register to vote and that they vote. And in between, we had a kind of teaching session where they went up to a deprived community in the north, in the Zambezi Valley, and they wanted to teach young people there how to make videos about their own lives, so that they could also put them on YouTube and on social media platforms, and people would know more about the way young people in the Zambezi Valley are surviving or not surviving, as the case may be. And that was a really incredible situation, because they are trained so well now that they can go up and do these kinds of things on their own. I don't have to be with them. I trained them on the first couple. And so they went up, a bunch of young women, and they have to do courtesy calls on the authorities. And apparently the main authority, which would be the ruling party, ZANU-PF authority, was not happy with them, although we have partners in the area that we work with all the time. And his idea was that they should have told them in time for the ruling party to select the participants in the project. And if they think they can just come up and do what they want when they want, they will soon learn differently, because they had the capacity to separate their head and limbs from their bodies. And not only could they do it in Binga, which is the town, but they can also follow them. They have the capacity to follow them. You know, so some of these young women were just in their 20s. I think one of them was still at college. Ruth was still at college at the time. She hadn't even graduated. And they were just completely petrified. And that happened to be in February this year. And that was the time when, was it in February this year, Olav? Anyway, Olav and I were on a train somewhere in Germany. And we had to have a conference with them on the train to try and calm them down. And they actually went ahead and did the project. And then they got someone from another section of the party coming at the end to commend them about how well they have done. You know, and this is how, what the situation is like in Zimbabwe. And so it's very difficult to do anything meaningful in the country, because everything is utterly controlled by ZANU-PF. And they have been masters at kind of creating a web of control that was not so obvious in the beginning. But now everybody can see it. Some people are for it, but most people just really see that it's having a deleterious effect on everything, on the economy, on livelihoods, on relationships, on families. So it's very difficult for me to operate. So at some point, I just decided that I wasn't going to make any more short films. And I was going to concentrate on the feature film projects that I have been developing for some time. So that's what I'm doing now. However, the short films are on YouTube. And I think the channel is called nyeraifilms.com. But I think if you just type in Sidangarembwa films, you know, that might pop up. But you can watch them there. The quality is not so good, but most of the short films that I've made with this collective are there. And there's only one which I really call my own, which is Mother's Day, or in the original title, Kare Kare Shako. And this is a film that is about, well, it's based on a folk tale that my grandmother told me. And it's about a man who eats his wife. And it's one of the most popular bedtime stories, or it was. it was at the time, when people were still telling children bedtime stories. And so my thinking was, how do we use what is unique to the culture of my part of the world to make films that are accessible to other parts of the world? And so when we tell our folk tales, we have singing, and there's always a call and answer. So I thought the musical is the obvious form, and then of course the dancing, and it will be different kind of dancing, so a different kind of spectacle. And so it was a kind of experiment, a proof of just to see whether what I was thinking would work. And it actually did work very well. And it's just unfortunate that in Zimbabwe, if you do something well, it doesn't really matter. You're actually better off doing things badly, because it's useful for the authorities to have incompetent people because then they are beholden to them. You know, so they're more likely to do what they're told. So I haven't made any films of my own for quite a while now, because I'm concentrating on a bunch of scripts that I've been developing for some time. But I hope you'll be able to find some. And this Kare Kare is definitely online. YouTube.
I was really interested when you said we make the films that we get the money to make. I think as young African artists, not only money, we write the books that people want to read, that in this economy are often about struggle and poverty and pain, or about moving to America. As someone who moves to America, so how do you share a meaningful story of yourself in your home country while remaining cognizant that people also want to hear that type of story? It's a struggle that I have.
Okay. It is a struggle, because I think also by moving, you don't just move physically, you also move psychologically. And so one is not able to access that which one has moved from in the same way that one could access it if one remained. So that really is, it's a challenge. I think one has to go back as often as possible to stay in touch. And for me, everything begins with my emotions, absolutely everything. And so I would say, look at your emotional world of engagement with that place, not even necessarily attachment. It doesn't have to be this kind of euphoric looking back. I mean, our countries have their problems. How can they not? Around the 16th century, the best of Africa began to be siphoned off in a commercial manner as product from the West Coast. And we talk about the West Coast, but of course people were mobile then. So people were moving from inside the country, so it affected everybody. And in fact, there's a study which shows that Zimbabwe, which is like right in the center of Central Southern Africa, was also affected by the slave trade. Not as much, of course, as those coastal areas, and I'm talking about the Atlantic slave trade here. But there was, of course, the East Coast slave trade. So there's been centuries of the very best of what the continent can offer just being taken away and nothing being put back. So this is the kind of place that we are talking about. We are talking about a place a continent that is suffering something like a phantom limb syndrome, you know, and we haven't been thinking about that. And I can really understand that the voices of those who suffered that Middle Passage and suffered that terrible treatment over here were loud and needed to be attended to. But there is a cooperative of black academics in Birmingham, led by Kenda Andrews, who I think is the Associate Professor of Political Studies or African Studies or something like that. And he is an extraordinary man, and he really is talking about all the different geography of our trauma as highly pigmented people. And I'm hoping that we are going to understand that the trauma on the west coast of the Atlantic is mirrored by an opposite trauma on the other coast. And having had that kind of societal amputation, if you like, that came with slavery, of course it was so easy to come in and colonize. And now you're no longer extracting living bodies, but you're extracting things that are in the earth, and again causing some destruction. And so now, for me, the new extraction that I see taking place, which is with the brain drain, and it is with our stories, even with stories like Black Panther, which was more benign than I thought it would be. But even there, it's our symbolic world that is now being extracted. So we've had different forms of extraction going on for half a century, and that's something that's difficult to cope with. So I think it's still important to engage with everything at the emotional level, including the things that cause one to say, I'm leaving. You know, we need to know what those things are, because when we have the geography of those things, we can start saying to ourselves, well then, how can we go about changing it so that people don't have to leave? So I would urge you to try to maintain that connection. Helps to go back physically, but to nurture it, the music, talking to people, this kind of thing. And I think it will bear fruit, because I see it bearing fruit already in some of the narratives that are coming out from different parts of the diaspora.
Can I? Oh, okay. One more question. Yeah. I just had a question about craft for you. I was curious to know, craft-wise, what techniques or devices, strategies you felt like either from your training in filmmaking or in your literary training became like I say, surfaced as like part of your wheelhouse, or became like radical departures from your training, whether in filmmaking, whether it be like montages or long shots or close-ups, or thinking about that, or literary, if it's any other kind of devices, anaphora, homoeophilutin, or I was curious to think of, on the level of craft, what techniques have surfaced for you in your wheelhouse, or have you just taken a radical departure from against your training?
Okay, the technique that I learned, and I'll refer again to Bellatar here, was the technique of experimentation with yourself. You have the general framework from your training, but you have got to know how to manipulate that general framework to get what you want in this moment. And I think that's something you have to trust yourself to do. And that's when you can get that unique look, that unique shot, that slightly different rhythm that's going to make people think, wow, this is different, without departing so much from form that it becomes unintelligible. I had a conversation with a Swiss professor, I think it's of graphic design. I was in Switzerland just a minute ago, and I said, do you know that if we as people of color made the films that our bodies tell us to make as a result of our experience, we would probably be making films that to less melanated people would be gibberish. Just in the sense that when people came to the shores and heard people speaking, they said it's gibberish, which we can't afford to do. But we cannot allow the impulse of that language to be abandoned completely, because then you simply have something that is not meaningful. Okay, so that is where the experimentation becomes so important. Okay, I've been told I have to do it like this. I've watched X, Y, Z, and they did it like this. Okay, I'm constructing it roughly in the same, but now I'm looking with my own gaze, and I am measuring what I see against the template that I have inside me. Is it matching? And if it isn't, then okay, so what's wrong? To find it and to correct it. And I think that's how one can find one's style.
Maybe just to close, I can read, or if you'd like to read.
No, please go ahead. You have such a lovely voice. Thank you.
One of my favorite passages from Black and Female, which is on this question both of healing from trauma and also of craft. Healing is weaving a knitting together and reintegration of the parts that were mangled and crippled, weaving of words, and through this process, reweaving time, action and reaction into a new whole, makes writing back against empire a site of potential for healing. Some writing raises a scar, puffy, often suppurating over the damage. The best writing opens the lesion again and again and cleanses. Here, the trauma subsides with every set of words, sentences, paragraphs, and pages. And I just want to thank you for your words on paper and in the air with us today, which are helping us, slowly but surely, to recover from these traumas, to heal, to build new capacities, and to find new ways of seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest.